Today's lesson is Lesson 13, the nation's capital. Have you ever been to a capital city? Have you visited a state or provincial capital or been to a national capital? Capitals are interesting and bustling places with special energy in the air. The history a capital city possesses, the official nature of governmental buildings, and their activities, as well as the heritage of its culture, all combine to create a symbolic and vibrant community. Have you ever wondered how a capital is chosen? Location, political influence, the safety of the lawmakers, and a bit of compromise all play a part in the decision. As we learn today about the story of the United States capitals, they have actually been more than you may think. You will see that the most important factor in placing the capital city was compromise. If that word seems familiar, it's because it comes up nearly every lesson on the history of the United States. Let's explore how a compromise placed the present-day capital. But first, let's take a look at the many places that Congress met during the formation of the new country. Timeline of the United States Capitol. The first one, September 5th, 1774, December 12th to 1776, was Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The First and Second Continental Congress met here, and this is also where the Declaration of Independence was signed. The second one was from December 20th, 1776, through February 27, 1777, was Baltimore, Maryland. The British were approaching Philadelphia, and the Congress had to leave town to stay safe. In Baltimore, they had to meet for enough from the harbor so that the British Navy fire couldn't reach them. The third was March 4th, 1777, through September 18, 1777, and that was Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The British threat to Philadelphia was temporarily over, so the Congress headed back to their town. The fourth one, September 27, 1777, was Lancaster, Pennsylvania. The British succeeded in capturing Philadelphia, so the Second Continental Congress fled to Lancaster for a very short stay, just one day. The fifth one, September 30th, 1777, through June 27th, 1778, was York, Pennsylvania. This was a better long-term site and the place where the Articles of Confederation were passed. The sixth one, July 2nd, 1778, through June 21st, 1783, was Philadelphia, Pennsylvania again, and the British left Philadelphia, so the Americans returned once again here. On the 8th, November 26, 1783, to August 19, 1784, Annapolis, Maryland was there, and Pennsylvania was still not safe, so a move to Maryland came next, while there Washington submitted his resignation from the Continental Army. The 10th one was January 11th, 1785 to August 12th, 1790. It was New York City, New York. Washington became president during this period and was inaugurated on the balcony of the Federal Hall, the Capitol meeting place. On the 12th, November 17th, 1800, to the present, Washington, D.C., the United States Congress relocated to their long-term home, where it still remains today. And the 7th is June 30th, 1783 to November 4th, 1783. Princeton, New Jersey. The members of Congress had to leave Philadelphia for their own safety once again. Not from the British, but from angry veterans who hadn't been paid for their service. The Treaty of Paris was also signed during this time. The 9th one was November 1st, 1784 to December 24th, 1784, and it was Trenton, New Jersey. The Congress headed next to Trenton, and perhaps the strangest meeting place yet, the French Arms Tavern. The 11th was December 6, 1790 to May 14, 1800, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. This was a return to Philadelphia for a period of 10 years after Washington, D.C. was chosen as the permanent site for the capital. The capital at New York. As you saw in the timeline, the Congress left Philadelphia in 1783 due to a protest by unpaid American soldiers. During this Pennsylvania mutiny, the veterans refused to allow delegates to leave their meeting place until they received their overdue pay. Doesn't this sound a lot like Shays' Rebellion? It was a very similar situation. Eventually, the conflict sent the representatives packing and their nomadic journey through the states, lasting through the end of the war. In 1785, they landed in New York City, which was where the capital was at that time when the Constitution was enacted. That means that under the current symbol of government, a democratic republic, New York City was the first United States capital. It didn't remain there, but still had the honor of hosting the very first presidential inauguration. After the Constitution was ratified, the government needed a permanent home. As you might expect, there was a lively debate in Congress over where that home should be. Northern states wanted a capital in their region, and southern states wanted one in theirs. There was even discussion of having two capitals, one in the north and one in the south. The writers of the Constitution came up with a compromise. The capital wouldn't be in one specific state. Rather, it would be its own independent district, and Congress would decide the location. This seemed reasonable, but the question still remained, where would this new district be? The Residence Act. A compromise was worked out in which the northern and southern states both got something. The northern states had a huge amount of debt from the war, and they wanted the new government to help them pay. Not surprisingly, the southern states didn't particularly want to take on a debt they felt wasn't their responsibility. James Madison, who represented the southern state of Virginia, led the resistance to this plan in Congress. At the same time, Alexander Hamilton from the northern state of New York was doing his best to convince Congress to pass the plan. In June of 1790, the two men gathered for a discussion and came up with a compromise. The southern states would support the request for payment assist from the north, while the northern states would agree to a southern site for the permanent capital. The Residence Act, as their compromise was called, passed Congress in July and placed the site of the capital along the Potomac River between the states of Virginia and Maryland, what we now know as Washington, D.C. You may have guessed that Washington in Washington, D.C. comes from the war hero and first president. But do you know what the D.C. stands for? It is the District of Columbia, or originally the Territory of Columbia, a reference to the explorer Christopher Columbus, and a name sometimes used for America during the Revolutionary War years. The capital of Philadelphia. During much of America's infancy, the capital was located in Philadelphia. Most people expected it would be chosen as the permanent capital, too. As you have just learned, the compromise between the states was one of the reasons this didn't happen, but there were other reasons as well. A yellow fever epidemic struck Philadelphia in 1793, and people began to question the safety of keeping the capital there. Despite the decision to place the capital in Virginia and Maryland area in 1790, the move would actually not take place until the 1800s. This was mainly to allow time for the infrastructure of the new site to be built, but it also left the capital in Philadelphia for those 10 years. The Pennsylvanians took full advantage of this time to try to convince Congress that Philadelphia was a much better suited to be the new national capital. They built a beautiful mansion that was offered as the residence for the president and began to build federal buildings of their own to house the government. All this was to no avail, however, and in May of 1800, the United States government made the move south to Washington, D.C. While the Residence Act outlined the general area where the new capital would be, George Washington, as president, had the unique responsibility of choosing the specific location. He chose Pierre Charles L'Enfant, a Revolutionary War veteran, as the designer of the new capital. L'Enfant created a beautiful space with wide, graceful streets and strategically placed buildings. The Capitol building, for instance, is set on a hill overlooking the city with a broad avenue leading down to the White House, the president's home. These buildings, along with many others in the cities, are designed as a classical architectural style. L'Enfant was a native of France, and many of his design ideas were inspired by his hometown in Paris. The capital city today. The city of Washington, D.C. has gone through many changes over the years. It was mostly burnt to the ground during the War of 1812. More on that to come. It also shrunk with part of the federal district's land was returned to Virginia in 1847. In spite of some dramatic changes, it has remained representative of American culture. Its vibrant and tolerant ambience is reminisce of its beginnings, born out of a compromise between separate states struggling to find unity and a national identity. If you visit Washington, D.C. today, you will undoubtedly notice this unique environment. It is a city full of history and an exciting blend of international cultures, characteristic of America itself. One of your activity breaks, you can look up some pictures of the original government buildings in Washington, D.C., as well as some other examples of classical architecture. How do they compare, and what features are common to classical buildings? What impressions do the buildings give? If you'd like, you can also look up some pictures of the Palace of Versailles in Paris. Do you see the similarities? And you can talk about, do you think Washington, D.C. is still the best place for the United States Capitol today? Consider factors like location, proximity to infrastructure and resources, population, and defense. If you could, would you choose to move the Capitol to a different location? And why or why not? This concludes our Lesson 13 for today.